They kept him in a metal box for 4,380 days. No warmth, no love, no name, just numbers and needles, until the activist walked in. And he did something no one thought a test animal could do. He hugged her. He was Subject 42, not a name, not a life, just a code stenciled above the sealed steel door of his containment unit. He hadn't seen sunlight in 12 years. No sky, no breeze. Only the sterile hum of artificial lights and the echo of footsteps that never meant kindness. He was taken from his mother before he even knew how to hold on. And for over a decade, his world had been nothing but injections, electric shocks, cages, and silence. The researchers said it wasn't cruelty. It was science. They said he couldn't feel grief the way humans do. They were wrong. He remembered fear. He flinched before hands reached for him. He shivered at the sound of keys and he cried. Low, helpless sounds that never brought comfort. Time blurred. He stopped expecting rescue. Hope, that fragile thing, dissolved like the vitamins they injected into his meals, until the door opened, and she walked in. Lena Hart wasn't supposed to be there. She was just auditing compliance protocols for a charity that had donated funds to the lab. When she took a wrong turn into the lower wing, she found a door unlike the others. Old, scratched, padlocked. She opened it, driven by something she couldn't name. What she found wasn't a beast or a subject. It was someone broken and still waiting to be seen. At first, she said nothing, just sat. Hours passed. He didn't react, didn't threaten, didn't even move. His breathing was the only sign that he was alive. But on the third hour, he looked at her, just briefly, and something inside her broke. The next day she returned, and the next, always with soft words and peeled apples, always keeping her distance. Trust she knew couldn't be asked for. It had to be offered. 12 days in, it happened. Slowly, gently, he reached out a trembling hand and placed it on her knee. Then he wrapped his arms around her awkwardly, uncertainly, but with unmistakable intent. He hugged her, and she, through tears, hugged him back. From that moment on, his world began to change. She brought him crayons. He began to draw. Circles, trees, hands reaching toward one another. He listened to her read aloud, sometimes watching her lips, sometimes just closing his eyes to the rhythm of her voice. She showed him his reflection. He didn't flinch. He stared, like someone trying to remember himself. And then Lena leaked the footage. The world reacted. Headlines screamed. Politicians scrambled. Protests erupted. The facility was shut down. Subject 42, now named Jonah, was sent to Primrose Primate Refuge. And for the first time since he was taken as a baby, he stepped outside into sunlight. He didn't run. He didn't cry. He just looked up, eyes squinting, chest rising, and breathed. Not a shallow gasp like the ones he'd learned to survive on, but a full, slow inhale that expanded his ribs as if his body had forgotten what it was like to contain life. The wind startled him at first. It touched his fur like fingers he didn't fear. Leaves rustled above him, and for a moment he crouched low, unsure if the sound meant threat or freedom. But when no doors slammed shut, when no voices barked commands, he stood straighter. The grass beneath his feet bent gently under his weight, soft and unjudging. It was the first thing he'd ever touched that didn't push back. Lena watched from a distance, hands trembling around the camera she wasn't supposed to have brought, but she needed to remember this. Needed the world to see what healing looked like. Not in words, but in breath and posture, and eyes that finally had something to look at. Jonah didn't run. He explored in slow, looping circles, eyes scanning the tree canopy, nostrils flaring with every scent. Dirt, bark, pollen, rain in the distance. His muscles twitched with instinct, but they weren't guided by fear anymore. They moved because he wanted to move. The other chimps at the refuge kept their distance at first. Some were still learning to trust people. Others weren't sure what to make of the new one who arrived so quietly. But Jonah didn't challenge them. He didn't posture or bark. He simply sat under a maple tree, legs folded, fingers tracing the edge of a fallen leaf as if remembering what softness was. He took to drawing again. Lena had left the crayons and paper in the corner of his enclosure, expecting them to be ignored. But one afternoon, a staff member found a dozen pages lined neatly on the floor. They weren't chaotic or wild. They were deliberate. Sunrises, open doors, a woman with red fabric around her neck, and always hands. Reaching, offering, waiting. When the caretakers began training sessions, he didn't resist. He didn't obey either. He listened, watched, assessed. And then when he was ready, he participated. Not because he was told, but because it made sense to him. They realized quickly that he responded not to treats or commands, but to rhythm, repetition, soft speech, and patient eyes. One evening, as a storm rolled in, the other chimps scrambled for cover, but Jonah stayed outside, staring at the dark sky like it was a puzzle he was almost ready to solve. Thunder cracked overhead. He didn't flinch. Rain began to fall, slow, warm drops at first, then harder, until the ground turned to mud. But still he stood, arms loose at his sides, head tilted back. When lightning split the clouds and lit up the world in stark white for a single second, a caretaker watching from the observation window said she saw something. Jonah, arms slightly raised, as if reaching for something only he could see. She cried without knowing why. The next day he was different. Not louder, not bolder, but open. He began sitting near the new rescues, especially the younger ones. When they trembled, he would place a hand near theirs, not touching, just near. He shared his food. He curled his long arms around the smallest ones at night, like he remembered what it meant to be held. When Lena brought him books, he turned the pages slowly, his fingers brushing each wordless image, as if trying to memorize them. She played recordings of forest sounds, streams, birds, rustling branches. Sometimes he'd press his ear to the speaker. Sometimes he'd close his eyes and rock gently, as if following a current that no longer frightened him. They gave him a soft blanket once. He carried it everywhere. On particularly warm days, Jonah would sit under his favorite tree, holding the blanket in his lap like a memory made tangible. And when he saw Lena approach from across the field, her red scarf fluttering like a flag of familiarity, his face would shift. Not a grin, but a relaxation, a release. She would kneel beside him, showing him old photos of forests, of baby chimps, of him. She told him stories, though she wasn't sure if he understood the words. She told him about his rescue, about the lab, about the moment he hugged her. He always listened, and when she'd finish, he would sometimes place a hand gently on her knee, just as he did that first time. A silent thank you, a bond sealed in scars and silence. And when he fell asleep, sometimes in her lap, sometimes beneath the open sky, he didn't twitch from nightmares anymore. No jerks, no cries, just breathe, deep and unbroken. The sanctuary's director, who had doubted Lena at first, eventually admitted what none of them had expected. Jonah wasn't just healing, he was helping others do the same. They began calling him the quiet anchor. When other chimps panicked during vet exams, Jonah would sit in view, calm and still. When newcomers arrived trembling, he'd be the first to approach. And one day, a little female named Mira, rescued from another lab, missing 2 fingers, curled up beside him without hesitation. Jonah placed his blanket over her shoulders. It was the first time anyone had ever seen him share it. The blanket had been his constant, a silent companion through thunderstorms and restless nights, folded carefully each morning like something sacred. To watch him drape it over Mira's narrow shoulders, without prompting, without audience, was like witnessing an oath passed between beings who had both lost too much to trust easily. The caretakers watching from behind the glass didn't speak. They didn't need to. In that moment, something unspoken shifted at Primrose. Mira never left his side after that. Wherever Jonah went, she followed, like a shadow stitched to his stride. She mimicked the way he held his food, the way he tested the ground with his fingers before stepping forward. She copied his habit of sitting near newcomers, placing herself beside the most frightened chimps, not to touch or soothe, but simply to exist in their space until they realized they were safe. It was as if Jonah had passed some invisible code to her, not through commands or dominance, but through presence. Staff began referring to them as the pair, and with time, their bond became something of a ritual at the sanctuary. Mornings began with Jonah rising first, retrieving the blanket from its hook, and waiting silently until Mira stirred beside him. They'd sit in the enclosure doorway together, watching the sun warm the grass, their backs pressed lightly together, not leaning, just aligned. When Lena returned after a short illness, the first thing Jonah did was bring her a drawing. It was simple: 2 chimpanzees under a tree, the blanket drawn in a deep violet crayon, draped between them like a bridge. He handed it to her without ceremony, then stepped back and sat quietly beside her feet, his hands folded like always. Lena cried, not loudly, not with sobs, just the kind of tears that come when something inside you settles after a long ache. She tucked the drawing into her journal and didn't say a word. Jonah didn't need her words. He never had. The sanctuary director, watching the scene from afar, later confided to a colleague that Jonah wasn't just a former lab subject. He was a teacher of patience, of gentleness, of trust, built not through training, but through time. As months passed, Jonah's influence spread in subtle, profound ways. Chimps that once refused to be touched during medical exams began allowing brief contact when Jonah was near. One of the most anxious rescues, a young male with self-harming behaviors, stopped hitting his own face whenever Jonah was within sight. The staff couldn't explain it. Behaviorists offered theories. But Lena knew. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was the result of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in years, and then turning that vision outward toward others still trapped in their silence. Jonah never demanded leadership, but he became the center of every quiet moment. The others responded not to his power, but to his stillness. And that stillness began to reshape the rhythm of the sanctuary. In group enrichment sessions, Jonah would often position himself slightly apart, not aloof, but observant. He'd let the others explore first, testing new tools and puzzles with a cautious grace. When one of them succeeded, he'd offer a nod, a subtle lowering of the eyes, a tiny clench of his fingers. Affirmation without fanfare. And when one failed or panicked, he'd wait, offer space, and return later to try again beside them. It was that patience that drew the attention of a filmmaker visiting the sanctuary. She had come for a short documentary on rehabilitation. She stayed for 3 months. Her footage, once edited, would reveal a truth that photos couldn't capture: that healing is not loud. It does not arrive in grand moments or dramatic scenes. It unfolds slowly, in glances, in pauses, in shared blankets on cold mornings. The final scene of the documentary showed Jonah sitting under the old maple tree, Mira curled beside him, both watching a younger chimp take her first tentative steps into the open enclosure. Jonah didn't move. He simply waited, his eyes fixed on her with the quiet belief that she could do it. The film was called The Quiet One. When it premiered online, it reached millions within days. People who had never thought about animal testing began asking questions. Volunteers flooded Primrose with support letters and donations. Children sent crayon drawings of Jonah holding hands with chimps and humans alike. A group of retired veterans sent a letter titled "From One Survivor to Another," signed with trembling hands and stories of their own silence. And still, Jonah didn't seem to notice the cameras. He continued to rise early, sit beneath the same tree, and wait for the others to join him. He groomed Mira gently now, something he hadn't done in the early days. His touch was slow, deliberate, never forceful. It was as if every movement carried a memory of pain, of loss, and of the long journey back to gentleness. On the anniversary of his release, Lena brought a small plaque to the sanctuary. It wasn't fancy, just a piece of sanded wood with a single sentence engraved in plain lettering. He reminded us what healing looks like when no one is watching. They placed it at the base of Jonah's tree, beneath the spot where the morning light always hit first. Jonah approached it that afternoon, Mira in tow. He sat down beside it, touched the wood with one hand, and then, unexpectedly, looked up at the sky. Not in confusion, not in search, just in acknowledgement. As if he understood in some quiet corner of his mind that the pain had not been in vain, that someone had noticed, that the world which once forgot him behind a locked steel door now remembered him not as a number, but as a presence. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the ridge, Jonah stayed out longer than usual. Mira dozed nearby, her head resting against his arm, while the other chimps moved slowly through the grass, their silhouettes stretching long and golden. A caretaker passed by the enclosure, pausing to collect empty bowls, and Jonah watched her without alarm. He didn't move. He didn't retreat. He simply followed her with his eyes as she worked. Calm, deliberate, predictable. And when she looked back and gave him a quiet nod, he blinked once and returned it. It was moments like that, small, barely noticed by others, that defined Jonah's world now. He no longer needed to prove his survival. He had nothing to perform. He had grown into a creature of habit and rhythm, not because the past had left him unscarred, but because he had chosen to live without letting those scars define him. His past was a landscape of loss, but his present had become a field of quiet rituals. Grooming Mira in the morning sun, circling the same row of cedar trees each afternoon, sitting with the new arrivals during their first storm. And it was the storms that told the most. Every time thunder rolled across the valley, the younger chimps cried, fled, froze in corners of their enclosures. But Jonah stayed in the open. He never flinched. He would lift his face toward the sky and sit with his arms resting loosely on his knees, inviting calm into the space around him. The staff began calling it the still circle, and eventually new chimps learned to find their way to him during bad weather. They'd gather, inching closer, until a half-dozen anxious hearts beat quietly in unison around him. Their fear dissolved not by commands, but by proximity to his peace. And then there was the journal. One morning, a young intern named Caleb discovered a spiral notebook in the keeper's hut labeled Jonah Observations. It was filled with entries not by scientists, but by the staff themselves. Notes like, watched over Mira all night after her procedure, did not sleep. Sat with Oko for 45 minutes after he refused food. No contact, just sat. Touched the engraved plaque today, first time since placement. Looked at a photo of Lena for over 10 minutes without blinking. The final entry in Lena's handwriting read, he's not just healing, he's teaching, not us how to care for chimps, but how to be better humans. That page was later framed and hung beside the supply cabinet. Not for tourists, not for donors, just for them. The ones who had watched Jonah stitch himself back together one silent act at a time. Lena, for her part, never once claimed credit. When reporters reached out asking to interview her about Jonah's transformation, she declined every time. She'd smile softly, fold her hands and say, he did the hard part. I just opened the door. Still, she visited. Not as often now. Her work had shifted to legislation and advocacy, but always with the same red scarf, the same calm step, and the same reverence. When she arrived, Jonah always noticed. He didn't run to her. That had never been his way. But he would rise, walk to her slowly, and stand in front of her until she reached out and placed her hand over his. They would sit that way for long minutes, two beings who had once been broken in different ways, now sharing a silence that needed no translation. And it was on one of those visits that she brought the harmonica. Not new, not polished. It was old and dented, its brass worn thin in places, the kind of instrument passed down, not purchased. She didn't play it. She simply handed it to Jonah and whispered, it was my father's. He used to say it made the world feel smaller. Jonah held it like it was made of breath itself. For the next week, he carried it everywhere. He never played it, just touched it, turned it in his fingers, held it to his chest during rest. And one evening, as the last of the sun slid beneath the horizon and the trees whispered with the hush of wind, Jonah raised the harmonica to his lips and blew a single, shaky note. It cracked. It wheezed. It barely held together. But it was sound, not a warning, not a cry, a choice. A new caretaker, watching through the trees, said she thought her heart stopped. The other chimps fell still. Even the breeze seemed to pause. Jonah looked around at the faces turned toward him. Mira, the young ones, the staff behind the fence. And then he blew another note, then another. Not a song, not yet, but a rhythm, a pulse, a beginning. From that night on, every dusk at Primrose ended with sound. Sometimes soft, sometimes broken, but always his. And as the stars blinked open above the ridge and the valley settled into sleep, Jonah sat beneath his tree, the plaque resting in the dirt beside him, the harmonica in his lap, and the entire sanctuary breathing with him. Not behind him, with him. That was the difference. That was the legacy already forming around Jonah before anyone had dared use the word. He was no longer just a figure in recovery. He was the quiet fulcrum around which a sanctuary slowly recalibrated itself. Not through instruction or authority, but through presence, through choice, through rhythm. Every routine at Primrose began to align with his natural pace. Volunteers, once loud with nerves, lowered their voices instinctively when they entered his section. Staff meetings started including a phrase that hadn't existed in the early years. Let's check how Jonah is responding first. New rescues were introduced through him. Not officially, but organically. It became known among the team that no behavioral assessment was complete until Jonah had shared space with a new arrival. He didn't always approach. Sometimes he simply sat, allowing the other to exist beside him in silence. And sometimes that was all it took for a trembling creature to take its first unafraid breath in years. There was the blind macaque who refused to eat until Jonah placed a peeled banana in front of her and stepped away. There was the aggressive capuchin, labeled untouchable by 3 previous centers, who curled up in the shade beside Jonah one afternoon and didn't growl for the rest of the week. And there was Mira, always Mira, whose trust in him grew into something like ritual, a sacred tether that gave her the courage to sleep in the open, to touch the feet of visiting children through the safety of mesh. It was around this time that the staff began planning the garden. It wasn't fancy, just a modest patch of land beside Jonah's enclosure, cleared by hand and planted with things he liked: sweet potatoes, carrots, low-branching shrubs to sit beneath. Volunteers donated time. Children sent seed packets in crayon-decorated envelopes. And when the first tiny sprouts broke the earth, Jonah sat beside them for hours, as if guarding something he hadn't known he'd planted. By the time summer folded into fall, the garden had become something else entirely, a meeting point. Staff took their breaks there. Visitors lingered longer than their tours required. And in the early evenings, as the sun slipped behind the ridge and the harmonica's notes drifted from Jonah's tree, people began to gather, not out of curiosity, but out of reverence. They didn't ask questions. They didn't take pictures. They just sat with him. On the anniversary of the documentary release, a letter arrived. It was from a family whose teenage son had been expelled from 2 schools and was living in court-ordered placement. They had watched The Quiet One together, and it had changed something. The boy, once unreachable, had asked for art supplies. He had drawn Jonah, then himself, then the 2 of them, side by side under a tree. "I think he saw himself in Jonah," the father wrote, and for the first time, he believed maybe healing was possible. Maybe it didn't have to be loud or fast, just real. The staff read the letter aloud that afternoon, gathered in the break room with the door open toward Jonah's enclosure. He was napping beneath the maple tree, the harmonica resting gently in the crook of his arm, Mira's hand loosely curled against his side. No one said a word. There was nothing to say. By winter, a new project had begun, the Jonah program, an initiative led by Lena and the sanctuary team to train other facilities in trauma-informed animal care, modeled not on Jonah's behaviors, but on the sanctuary's willingness to listen to them. It wasn't about replicating him. It was about recognizing that healing lived in spaces rarely measured, in stillness, in watching, in choosing not to speak until invited. And though Jonah never knew of this directly, he sensed the shift. New people arrived not with checklists, but with open hands. They sat first before reaching. They waited before naming. And when they entered his space, they brought nothing but themselves. He aged with dignity. His fur thinned, his shoulders curved, his pace slowed, but his presence never dulled. In fact, it deepened. Every year, a new generation of staff would come, unsure of their footing, uncertain of how to care for animals carrying so much invisible weight. And Jonah would meet them with the same unhurried rhythm, a glance, a pause, an allowance, and they would learn. Not through manuals, not through lectures, but by staying long enough to witness what had nearly been erased from him, the capacity to rebuild trust, not by demanding it, but by offering it without condition. There was one winter evening when a child with selective mutism visited the sanctuary. Her parents had tried everything: therapy, programs, interventions. Nothing had worked. She sat curled in her coat, silent and tight as a knot, unwilling to step near the animals, until she heard the harmonica. Jonah wasn't playing it for her. He never played it for anyone. He just sat beneath the maple tree and blew a low, winding tune that barely rose above the cold air. And the girl walked toward him, not all at once, not quickly. But by the time the last note faded, she was sitting beside the fence, one hand extended, not to touch, just to be seen. That night she whispered her first word in months. "Hello." The staff wrote it down, not because they needed proof, but because sometimes healing comes quietly, and the only way to honor it is to remember. When Jonah began to slow, no one said the word goodbye. It wasn't needed. The rhythm of his life, once defined by silence and fear, had settled into something so natural, so steady, that even its slowing felt like a continuation rather than an ending. He still rose with the sun, still sat beneath the maple tree, still carried the harmonica in the crook of his arm like a memory he could touch. But his steps were softer now, his breaths deeper, his pauses longer. Mira never left his side. She had grown into a calm, watchful presence, his mirror in more ways than one. When Jonah moved, she moved. When he stopped, she leaned against him. When he slept, she draped the old violet blanket over his shoulders, folding it with the same care he once did for her. Their bond, forged through gentleness, had become something the staff often called sacred without ceremony. And Lena? Lena came more often in those final weeks. She didn't speak much during her visits. She just sat, her legs folded beneath her, her red scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, watching the same tree they had shared for nearly a decade. Jonah would greet her by resting his palm against her knee, his version of hello, of I remember, of thank you. One cold morning, the sky thick with silver clouds and the air still with quiet, Jonah didn't come out from his sleeping area. Mira sat outside the doorway, alert but calm, as if she already knew what the others were just beginning to suspect. When Lena arrived, called in by a soft voice over the phone, she entered the enclosure with slow, even steps. He was there, curled into the corner of his nest, the blanket tucked beneath his chest, the harmonica resting beside his hand. He was still warm, still breathing, but barely. Lena knelt beside him and placed a hand over his, then looked into the eyes that had once held only fear and now held nothing but peace. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "You showed them." Jonah didn't stir, but as the wind shifted and carried the scent of pine through the open windows, his fingers closed softly around hers. It was the last thing he ever did. He passed that evening. No alarms, no struggle, just one long, final breath, as if exhaling a life that had taken years to reclaim. The sanctuary held a memorial not for a mascot, not for a symbol, but for a friend. Volunteers, staff, former interns, donors, and visitors gathered beneath the maple tree. Someone played a few soft notes on the harmonica, not a song, just sound, and for a long time no one spoke. They placed his drawing of two figures under the tree in a frame beside the plaque, and Mira sat with them the entire time, the violet blanket folded across her lap. Lena didn't stand to speak, but before she left, she walked to the garden, knelt in the soil, and planted something new. Lavender, the same kind her father used to grow. She pressed it deep, patted the earth, and whispered, "For the next one who needs silence." In the months that followed, Primrose didn't shrink without Jonah. It grew. A new wing was built, a therapy program launched for traumatized children, and at the entrance to the garden, a new sign was placed. Carved in wood, simple and clear, the Jonah Grove, where quiet becomes safety. Children come there now and draw. They sit beside chimpanzees and don't ask questions. They hum, they listen, they heal. And every year on the anniversary of Jonah's release, the sanctuary gathers under the maple tree to play a song that has no name, on a harmonica that still echoes when the wind carries just right. No statue was built for Jonah, no mural painted, Only this truth, spoken softly by those who knew him best. He didn't change the world by roaring. He changed it by waiting long enough for us to hear him. And we did. If Jonah's story touched you, even just a little, let it stay with you. Share this video. Leave a comment. Tell us about the moments, the animals, the people who taught you that healing doesn't need to shout. And if you believe that even the quietest lives deserve to be heard, subscribe. For the ones still waiting behind closed doors, for the silence that still needs to be listened to, for Jonah.